Hey guys, making this video to share something new that I've recently added to Avmark. One of my goals this quarter is to take our exotic care up a level and have it be more comparable with the care that we provide for canines and felines. So the first step that I've taken to make this happen is I've made glossaries for a couple different things. So I've made history glossaries for reptiles, avians, rabbits, and then I made a fourth one for other small mammals that's a little more generic. There are some very specific questions that we need to ask about husbandry for these animals. Probably 90% of the issues that we have is usually going to be because of their environment. So there's a ton of questions we have to ask ahead of time, so that way when we get them in, we can have the most accurate, best care for them. Part of the reasons that we have such an in-depth history is because we need the person that's able to answer these questions. So if someone's mom brings in their lizard and knows nothing about how the cage is set up, what type of cleaners used, things like that, that's not going to help us necessarily get to a good diagnosis, and we might have to run a lot more tests, or it just might be a little more inaccurate, and our treatment will be harder to decide if we don't have the answers to these questions. So the glossaries are long, they are in depth, they do need to be answered ahead of time just to make sure we have all of the information that we need. So I'm going to go into our reptile, our avian, and our rabbit, so stay tuned. Okay, so for our reptile history, for all of these phone calls, we're going to take the same information we would for a cat or a dog. Owner's information, pet's information. For these exotics, we absolutely have to know the breed, the sex, and their age for all of them. The next thing we move to is how long have they had their pet. After that, we need to know where they got their pet from. Was this a pet store? Was this a breeder? Was this someone on Craigslist? A friend? That helps us know a little bit more about what kind of care has transpired before the person has gotten this pet, and definitely how long the pet has been receiving this care from this particular owner. Next thing we need to know is how often do they handle their pet. This will help us just determine maybe the stress level that this pet might experience. If the pet's handled all the time, it might not be as big of a deal for it to come to a vet, but if a pet spends majority of its time in its enclosure and never comes out, then it might be a more stressful situation. And also, the more time that they're out of their environment, the more time they have to get into things they're not supposed to. So we'd like to know how often they handle their pet. Next set of questions has to do with their cage location, things like that. So we need to know where the cage is located. This is important because we need to know, is it underneath an AC vent? Is it close to the window? Is it on a shelf where their cat can jump up and stare at them all day? Like, we need to know what kind of environment, what kind of accessibility this cage has. And then also, well, I'll get into the birds later. But anyway, so for reptiles, we need to know location, size, type, and substrate. Reptiles, what types of cages can they have? They can have aquariums, terrariums, they can have wire cages. I hope not, but they could. So we need to know what type of cage they're in as well. We also need to know what kind of substrate they have. The substrate is the material that's on the bottom of the cage. So some people use like coconut shells or walnut shells or pine or things like that. And some substrates are not good for certain pets. So we need to know what's on the bottom of their cage floor. We also need to know how big their cage is. Some reptiles will only get a certain size in certain size environments, so we need to know what we're working with there. And then we also need to know how often their cage is cleaned and what type of cleaner is used. I'm sure we all know that some chemicals and cleaners are not great for pets, and especially these little exotics are more sensitive to these things, so we need to know what's being used and how often. Also for reptiles, lighting is important. Some of them need certain bulbs, so we need to know if they do have any type of lighting and if it is a certain type of bulb. So ask them about that. Heat source, also very important. We have our cold-blooded reptiles, and there are several different types of heat sources they can have. So sometimes they have a heat lamp, sometimes they can have a pad underneath their enclosure that heats from the bottom up. Sometimes they'll have a heat rock. You don't have to tell the owners this, but we don't always recommend a heat rock because it's one isolated source of heat. There's just one hot spot and one cold spot, and not so much of a gradient temperature where they can choose how warm or how cold they want to be. And sometimes with heat rocks, they can burn themselves. So it's always good to know what kind of heat source they have available. That's next thing. Monitoring the cage temperature. We need to know what that is. Still very important with cold-blooded animals. And if they do monitor the cage temperature, what is it? What do they usually try to leave it on? Also humidity. There are some reptiles that need a little humidity gauge in there so we can see how much moisture is in the air. So do they monitor the humidity, and what is it? Next thing we need to know is how often is our pet out of their enclosure, and then if they ever bring them outdoors. We know Keverly's got that amazing turtle set up, so some people do bring their reptiles outside, some people only leave them inside. So we need to know how much exposure to other things they have. Next thing, type of food and water and how much. For snakes especially, is it live, is it frozen? Turtles, we need to know if it's pellets, if it's fresh fruit. Lizards, kind of same thing. Crickets, like things like that. So we need to know what they're eating. Any supplements added to diets. You can load crickets. There's a powder you can sprinkle on them. And they're called gut loaded. You can also do that with mealworms, things like that. So we need to know if they are adding any supplements to their meal. How often the bowls are cleaned and refilled. Just good husbandry again, like we just need to know how often they're doing that. The fecal consistency, this will tell us a lot about reptiles. If they can bring in a fecal sample, that's also really great. So we can kind of look at what's going on with that. When's the last time they shed? Obviously, not every reptile sheds their skin, so I wouldn't ask this from a turtle or a tortoise owner, but a lizard or a snake, I would definitely want to know that, because at different times it kind of changes their personality and how they're feeling. They might be more sluggish, so we need to know that. Sometimes they need help shedding, if you can believe that. So I'd ask them about their shedding habits as well and when that's happened. Then of course we want to know of any past health problems. And then we can start actually getting into the reason for the visit. So there's a lot of questions we need to ask ahead of time so that we can kind of set up, get prepared, get our doctors thinking about what could be happening with this animal, and then we actually get into what's going on and why they're calling today. So very important that we get all those answered before they come in. When we have the phone, make sure we're getting those questions answered. So the reason for the visit, and then on any meds. From there, you can ask your regular questions like vomiting, diarrhea, things like that, or whatever they're coming in for. All right, next one I'm gonna talk about is our avians, or the birds. Whenever people call and they wanna bring their birds in, there's some specific things we need to ask about that as well. So of course, regular history, but we need to know the breed, the sex, and their age. Also, same thing, how long have they had their pet? Where do they get their pet from? Things like that. How often do they handle their pet? Cage location, size, type, and substrate. And for birds, we're asking this for kind of similar reasons, but we definitely need to know the location, because we need to know if there's anything in the air. Are they by the kitchen? Because if you cook with certain pans and your bird is by the kitchen, that can be deadly to them. If you have an air freshener in your living room and the cage is right over there, that can be deadly. They don't regulate their body temperature as well, so if their cage is in the window in direct sunlight, we need to know that. So that's why we're asking where their cage is. Next thing we need to know is how big it is, because depending on what size bird, you need different size cages, so ask them that. What type of cage, and then the substrate. So not as much substrate for birds. Sometimes there's stuff underneath the little pull-out tray to kind of catch their droppings and everything, but we still want to know what's in their environment, what are they inhaling. They're very prone to respiratory issues, so very sensitive to things that are in the air, so we need to know everything around them. The next question I have that's specifically for birds is cage furniture. That's what it's called. So what is in their cage? What kind of perch do they have? We need to know if it's wooden. And if it is wooden, is it a stick that they found outside, or is it something they purchased from the pet store? Is it plastic? And then we need to know if it has a taper, because if it doesn't have a taper and the bird keeps grabbing the same size perch every day, it can cause pressure sores at the bottom of their feet. And so we need to know that if it does have a taper, if it's natural wood, if it's plastic, if it was bought from the store, if it was found outside, we need to know about their perch. And then also other cage furniture, like sometimes birds have more like mental things going on, like they get stressed, they get bored, they start picking their feathers. So we need to know, like, are their minds stimulated? Do they have mirrors? Do they have toys? Do they have bells or ropes, or just interesting things to do? Sometimes that can help them, so we need to know that as well. And then of course we're moving to the other questions about how often their cage is cleaned, what type of cleaner is used. Need to know that because we need to know what's in the air, just like I said earlier. How often are they out of their cage, and do they spend any time outside? So this is just trying to figure out what other areas they might be going in, what other things they could be exposed to. And then my next question is specific about any aerosols, plug-ins, or air fresheners used in the house. And this can be an aerosol air freshener, or it can be like an aerosol, like a pledge, like cleaner, just anything like that we need to know about. Type of food and water and how much. There are birds with different shaped beaks need different types of food. So some need pellets, some need seeds. There's songbird mixes. There's a bunch of different types of bird food you can buy. And if you get the wrong one for the wrong type of bird, it can really hurt them with their diet. That's all the food that they're taking in, and you're giving them the wrong thing. So we definitely need to make sure that we know exactly what kind of food they're feeding. And then the next thing I have is any supplements used, millet or a cuttle bone provided. So these are things that some birds need, some birds don't. Millet is a grain, and it's on this long stick, and it has fluffy yellow things on it. And some birds need that in their diet. And then also a cuttle bone, it's actually a dried fish that they clip to the side of the cage, and some birds need that for calcium and things like that. So ask if those things are in the cage. Then how often the bowls are cleaned and refilled, just husbandry and cleanliness, we need to know those things. Fecal consistency, same thing I explained earlier. It can tell us a lot, and if they can bring in a fecal sample, I'm sure the bird would provide one for us when it's here, but if they can bring one, that's great. Then we need to know about any other pets in the house, any dogs or cats that might be going by the cage, stressing them out, any other birds that might be sick in the house. We need to know about that. Then of course, past health problems. And now we're getting into the reason for the visit and if they're on any medications. So that's it about birds. Okay, so the history that I made about rabbits, same thing, need to know the breed, their sex, and their age. With rabbits, we want to ask if they're spayed or neutered. They can have reproductive issues just like dogs and cats if they're not spayed or neutered. So that's a big thing for us to know. Don't just assume that they are they aren't. Then we want to know, of course, how long they've had them, where did they get them from, how often do they handle them, how often are they out of their cage, and then if they're supervised. Rabbits are notorious for chewing on things they're not supposed to, so wires and cables and furniture and koozies and things like that, we need to know if they're supervised when they're out of their cage or not. And then if they ever go outside, we'd like to know that as well, of course. Cage location, size, type, substrate, same thing for the same reasons as these other ones. Does their pet share a cage with any other pets? This is important because we need to know if there are other rabbits in the cage with it. And even more important, some people house guinea pigs and rabbits together, which is not good. Rabbits can actually carry the Bordetella bacteria, like dogs and cats, and give it to guinea pigs. And guinea pigs are very susceptible and have a lot of upper respiratory issues with that. So we don't want to put rabbits and guinea pigs together. Also, rabbits might stress out the guinea pigs. Sometimes they're bigger. Doesn't matter. Anyway, we don't want to put them together. Just rabbits with rabbits, and we need to know if there are any more rabbits in their enclosure. How often the cage is cleaned, what type of cleaner is used, food and water and how much. We need to know if they are giving any fruits, vegetables, extra things like that. We need to know. Believe it or not, I think it's iceberg lettuce. Rabbits aren't supposed to have iceberg lettuce. Well, it's a long explanation, but they're not supposed to have it. So we need to know these things. And then we need to know about what kind of hay is offered. At different stages in their life, there's different percentages and different types of hay that they need. So we need to know if what they're getting is appropriate for how old they are. So we need to know hay offered, what kind, and how much. Then we need to know about their bowls, how often they're cleaned and refilled. And then we need to know if their pet does chew on anything. There are like different treats and chews and salt licks and things out there, so we need to know if they're chewing on anything that was store-bought, or if they do have toys, or if there's any household items that are around that they like to chew on, like I explained earlier. Fecal consistency, same thing, we need to know that. If there are any other pets in the house, we need to know if they're bothering each other or not. Past health problems, and then we move into the reason for the visit and if they're on any meds. The last glossary I made is a generic small mammal glossary. You can use that one for ferrets, mice, rats, sugar glider. Well, sugar gliders might have a different one eventually. anyway, guinea pigs, ferrets, things like that, because it's just a little bit more generic. We don't have to know as much about those pets, like specific questions. They all kind of fall under the same umbrella. So I'm sure I'll be developing more as time goes on. These are just the first big 3 that I'm starting with. Let me know if you have any questions, or if we do come up with anything we need to add. Of course, everything is going to be expanding and changing and getting better. So always open for suggestions. Thanks for watching. Y'all have a good day.